Welcome back to Purrfect Takes. I'm your host, Stephen Patton, joined as always by my co-host and dear friend, Jacob Acquire. And today we are talking about the seat that nobody really wants to be in, but unfortunately, because the NFL is cyclical and there has to be somebody at the short end of the stick, that there is a hot seat, and that hot seat gets hotter and hotter as we get into the season and as things unfold. And we'll talk about a few coaches. This is usually reserved for coaches and head coaches in particular, but we're going to apply it to players as well. Obviously, I'll just throw out the example that works, and we'll get more into it when we talk about the player. But a guy like Anthony Richardson, where you bring in competition to compete with him, or there's some, I would say, instability behind that player and a given roster. So we'll break that down as the episode goes on. But we'll start with the head coaches who are on the hot seat. We'll start in New York. Brian Daboll. He is a guy that hit the ground running his first year in New York. They make the playoffs, and it just all went downhill from there. And it was because of, I think, their overconfidence and what they walked into. And they didn't take the approach that Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane took in Buffalo. They didn't take the approach that Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah took in Minnesota, which was you had that early success. You look at the roster and you go, hey, we actually overperformed. We had no business being where we were. We're going to take a step back and kind of rip this apart to the studs and build this the right way. And we see that's worked in Minnesota. They went to the playoffs. They had a shot at being the number one seed with Sam Darnold at quarterback. Like, that's impressive. And then we've seen what Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane have built in Buffalo over the past half decade with building one of the better teams around one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. So all that being said is that they overextended themselves by signing Daniel Jones to a deal that he didn't need to get signed to. You let Saquon Barkley, Xavier McKinney, guys that became all pros this past year on other teams, walk out your door. And now a talent devoid of roster on the offensive side, question marks at quarterback. Brian Daboll is in a situation now where he's probably about to get canned if he doesn't perform.
Yeah, and frankly, I think you could have said that they could have been out the door last year, right? Or how the last season ended. Self-scouting and self-evaluation, I think, is so important in any industry that you're in, but in the NFL in particular, because you're one of 32 people in the world with a position like that. That goes for both head coach and general manager, excuse me. But I like how you related it to the Vikings, because that's the team they beat in the playoffs back in 2022. But the Vikings understood where they were. They were either 13-4 or 14-3 that year. They realized that that was pretty much a fluke, right? I think they were right down the middle in terms of EPA. Their point differential was like 0 or close to 0. So they understood that they got lucky in one-score games, or they were able to pull stuff out at the end of games, and decided to retool their roster. Now, one of the better rosters in the NFL, I would say, or at least in the NFC. I have pretty high expectations for the Vikings this season. I can't say the same for the Giants because, like you said, they doubled down. They doubled down on Daniel Jones, who even in his best year was probably QB 15, like not a very good or top end starter, to say the least, right? Decided not to franchise tag him, but franchise tag a running back who they ended up letting walk for nothing, like you said, who, by the way, won Offensive Player of the Year and won the Super Bowl last year. We talked about him on Tuesday, how his high impact season last year, if he does another one of those, could catapult him to the Mount Rushmore running backs. They let that guy walk for nothing. They let Xavier McKinney walk for nothing. And he started the year with like 4 or 5 games with an interception. Made me think of Kurt Coleman back in 2015, that I think 7 or 8 game stretch where he had a bunch of interceptions. But it's just, I think they didn't self-scout enough. Or if they did, they went about it the wrong way and tried to capitalize on luck instead of building a solid foundation. And now you look at a team that has a pretty good D-line, one of the best D-lines in the league, right? But outside of that, where are the advantageous positions on their roster? Where are the strengths of their roster? There are none, other than maybe one wide receiver, right? So I think that this is certainly the hottest seat. I think we talked about this a while back on Crowded QB Rooms, that between Daboll and the coach we'll talk about next, I think those are the 2 hottest seats. But Daboll for sure, and his general manager, Joe Shine, should both really, really tread carefully. And they have to put out some wins this year, because even if they get to like 5 wins and Jackson Dart plays the last 6 games, I don't think that's enough for them to stay.
5 wins isn't going to cut it. Not New York, not in that environment. They're tired of losing there. You have to put together an 8-9, 9-8 season with this combination of Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston. And like you said, once stuff starts going amok for them, which you start looking at the Giants' schedule, it's very easy for them to tailspin this year. And then, yeah, you're throwing a Jackson Dart in. Maybe at that point, Brian Dable's fired in season, and one of your coordinators is now the interim, and that creates a whole nother dynamic as you're heading into the offseason. So we'll see kind of the direction the Giants go. Right now, none of what they've done this offseason has given me, I say, a comfort for this year into 2025, but how they're building this, if they were to find a quarterback, if they were to build the offensive lineup, this is a team that could become a contender with a new regime. But again, I just don't see that in the Dable and Shine era. And I think what's great about that is that they didn't leverage themselves like a couple other franchises around the NFL have. The Miami Dolphins and Chris Greer being an example where you pretty much leverage your entire future for this 2 or 3 year window. The Giants didn't do that. They made some bad decisions, and it's probably going to lead to a couple of the head guys getting fired. But I don't think it's mortgaged their future, which is good for Giants fan as a whole moving forward, just sucks for this year. Now, a team that has mortgage and leverage, and I talked about the Miami Dolphins, and we'll get to in our honorable mentions Mike McDaniel, but another team that's leveraged themselves for a 2-3 year window that didn't pan out were the Cleveland Browns. You go all in for Deshaun Watson, you have the talent on both sides of the ball, and it doesn't work out for you. You make the playoffs a couple years ago with that star-studded roster. Jim Schwartz makes that defense come alive, and Kevin Stefanski was able to milk out what was left of Joe Flacco. And they're going to try to do it again this year with him, couple rookies, and Kenny Pickett. And I'm not confident in that quarterback room. I don't think anybody should be confident in that quarterback room. And if we've seen anything from the Browns over the past couple of years, they haven't been able to put it together on offense. And I don't think it changes this year. And I think it leads to Stefanski and that Browns front office getting fired, because I think Andrew Berry deserves to get fired just as much as Stefanski in this instance.
You mentioned leveraging and overextending. I don't think there's been any team that's done that as much as the Browns have the past since the Watson trade, so 3 or 4 years. And it's because of that trade, right? 3 first-round picks, some day 3 picks as well, but then a fully guaranteed contract, fully like 5-year guarantee. We saw Kirk Cousins get like 3-year guarantees, $90 million. This was over $200 million, 5 years, fully guaranteed. They're still paying the price for it. Watson won't play this year because of an injury, but even if he were healthy, they can't play him because he's just not a playable NFL player anymore. Even when he came back following the second year that he got there, he was horrible. They were winning games because of the defense. There was a stretch of like 4 or 5 games where he didn't score an offensive touchdown, and they were still winning because of like punt returns and Myles Garrett strip sacks and scores and things like that. That, we'll call it mistake, or their experiment with that failed so badly that even today they're having to do crazy things like draft multiple rookies, trade for Kenny Pickett, sign Joe Flacco off the street again, where I don't think he necessarily played at as high a level as he did in his previous stint with the Browns, like he did with the Colts last year. And now what are you left with? Like, what is the 100th percentile outcome for the Browns this year? 7, 8 wins, right? And even then, that's not enough to keep Kevin Stefanski and Andrew Berry around, in my opinion. And a lot of it's not their fault, right? The Haslams really went all in on this Deshaun Watson thing, and they've recently admitted that it's like most of the onus is on them. But still, I think that if you're the fan base, you can't really stand to keep this group around through multiple failed quarterback regimes, because part of that does fall back onto Stefanski. And so I think his seat is certainly hot, and it's going to be harder for the Browns to get out of whatever slump that they're in. What I will say in their favor is next year they should still have a top 5 pick, because I don't think they're going to be very good. And they have the Jacksonville Jaguars first round pick. The Jags could be anything. They could win 8 games, or they could be horrible again if Trevor Lawrence doesn't step up to the level that we know he can play at. So the Browns have some premium draft capital next year to maybe go and get a star QB that's in the draft, like a Drew Aller or somebody like that, whoever they prefer. But this year, at least, I just don't see it. I guess you could hope for Myles Garrett on his new payday to continue to perform well. Mason Graham, their first round pick, to play well next to him. But other than that, it just seems really, really rough for the Browns. And I really don't see a scenario based on merit that Stefanski and Andrew Berry stay after this season.
No, not in any scenario. It's unfortunate, but at the same time, they weren't against the ownership group and going, no, this move and sending 3 first-round picks is not going to make our team better. We can stay with a good quarterback in Baker Mayfield who had some injuries with his shoulder, get him back right, work with that, build around him, and try to make a playoff run from there. Instead, they got too cute with it, overextended themselves, and then put themselves in the mess they're in now. And unfortunately, Stefanski and Andrew Berry were still in those rooms when those decisions were made. And I'm assuming had they been emphatic enough in going, this will not work, the ownership group would have listened. They were obviously in some sort of accordance and agreement. And that's why, because of that decision and what has come from it, you're going to have to pay the price. Now, a team that doesn't overexert themselves, over leverage themselves.
They don't extend or leverage themselves in general.
No, what they have in the budget sheet, that's what they're working with. They don't try to get cute with any of the extensions, how they structure money, some of the guarantees, et cetera, et cetera. The way they do things is the way they do things, and that's the Cincinnati Bengals. And so it's hard for me to get on some of the head coaches that have been on that team because it's like they aren't necessarily working with as good of a roster as some of these other head coaches get to work with across the NFL. And that's unfortunate. It almost gets to, and this was before the 2011 CBA, but I felt really bad for Jim Schwartz with the Detroit Lions, is because the majority of their cap at one point was Matthew Stafford, Calvin Johnson, and Ndamukong Suh. And it was just because of how the payment structure worked for top 5 picks, and all of them were top 5 picks. So those kind of situations where you have talented pieces, but you don't have the depth to really go the distance with some of these heavyweights in the AFC, the NFC. I just don't see that changing. I like what they did this offseason didn't move me, taking a couple linebackers in the draft, a project defensive lineman to go with a pretty porous unit. And then you look on the offensive side of the ball and everybody wants to make all these excuses for Joe Burrow and his offensive line, which no shortage of this week on Twitter, but you're not doing anything to protect him. You're just giving him those same weapons he's had to work with, and you're expecting them to get better from that. So if they've been this 8-10 win team over the past 2 or 3 seasons, it just begs the question, like, are they haven't done enough to really take a step and be a playoff contender. And we talk about all these other teams getting better, the Chargers, the Broncos, the Ravens to an extent with some of their drafting. Like you're seeing teams pull away from them, and it's just I don't see how the Bengals keep up.
So I'm doing a series with 2 Point Conversion where I write like off-season progress reports, and I'm done with all the AFC ones. I have them loaded in the chamber. We're just waiting on graphics and stuff like that. Can you guess how many of the projected starters on offense are going to change from 2024 to 2025?
For the Bengals?
Yeah.
I would assume it's probably like 2, maybe 3 guys. So they're retaining like 8 to 9 of the starters.
The answer is 0. All 11 of their starters last year to end of the year are going to start week 1. That's the Our Lads projection. Maybe some of the rookies that they drafted in the late rounds, some of the interior guys might step up and win those roles. But other than that, it's the same. And when you talk about how this team, yes, they were top 10 marks in offense last year, like 7th in EPA, I think 7th in success rate, 6th in points scored. They had to be because their defense was so bad, right? If this were a balanced team, would we have seen Jamar Chase win the Triple Crown? Would we have seen the ball be run a little bit more because they had leads and stuff like that? They had to score all those points because the defense was so bad. And then you're talking about the offense and stuff like that, and I agree. I think the interior O-line, just pretty putrid. On the defensive side of the ball, things are worse because at least on offense, they finally broken the mold and decided to extend some players. On defense, they have a top 3 defensive end in the league, 2 or 3, and Trey Hendrickson. They still haven't gotten the deal done with him. Then they drafted a rookie. I don't know if it was an insurance policy or not, but it ended up being an insurance policy because of Hendrickson. They drafted Shamar Stewart, who isn't practicing due to offset language in his contract, which if you get down to the brass tacks of it, it's really about the Bengals trying to save $1 or $2 million if they cut him. You don't want to be cutting a top 20 first round pick. At least I wouldn't want to. That would reflect poorly on me as GM and my scouts and my coaches not being able to develop him. But if they cut him, they want to save 1 or 2 million, which, by the way, is less than 1% of the salary cap. But it's because the Cincinnati Bengals are so cheap that 1 to 2% means everything to them. And I don't know why. They're not going to extend their own players, so I don't know why it would mean so much to them. But this just archaic way of managing a team, I think, is catching up to them. And as far as Zach Taylor goes, I don't think he's innovative enough or provides enough from a play caller perspective to elevate the team to get them to where they want to be. I think there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of leash bought off of that 2021 Super Bowl run, which was largely off the backs of the defense magically turning up in the last 4 weeks of the season and going into the playoffs. They really, really outperformed what they were early in the season. I just don't see it. And while I'll say that I think Zach Taylor should be on the hot seat, you probably agree with me. I don't think he'll get fired because how long did it take them to fire Marvin Lewis when he was there? 17 years. And granted, he made it to the playoffs, but still never won a game. There's a year of 6 straight playoff appearances, didn't win a game. And then they didn't fire him. His contract just ran out. And so I just don't know I don't know how to rationalize how the Bengals are operating when they don't want to, or maybe they want to improve, but they just choose not to. And at some point, that is going to fall back on the coach because it's his job to win games.
The leash that Marvin Lewis was given is he was working with a second-round quarterback in Andy Dalton, made him look like a game manager, and the team looked complete. It wasn't like all offense, no defense, which I think is what's the Zach Taylor experience has turned into in Cincinnati. And at some point, hopefully I'll sit down and write an article or we'll have a in-depth episode about this. But I think there's been this run on offensive play callers being hired as head coaches. And so with that brain drain, I think there are some coaches that meet the criteria, that they truly are a cut above in terms of the play calling where they add a benefit there. And maybe Zach Taylor is doing that for the offense because it's been top 10 when the guys are healthy, when everything's rolling correctly. But it's been the defensive side. And I think his attention simply on the offense has allowed that side to drop off. And so you fire Lou Anarumo and, okay, you bring in new ideas, right? Maybe that's what you need, that to simplify the terminology and not keep it as complex. You literally hired an old linebackers coach from a couple years ago.
Who coached under Lou Anarumo.
I just and this is that's where I think Zach Taylor gets put on the hot seat. It isn't what's going on in the offensive side or how the team's being built. I think his hands get tied with some of that. I think it's how you're managing the coaching staff and the defensive side of the ball or lack thereof. And so that is, I think, going to be the nail in the coffin, because if you can't make the playoffs and you're spending all this money on superstars, something's got to give, because you're not going to just jettison these players. Maybe the new head coach comes in and it's like, nah, T. Higgins has got to go. We got to build an offensive line. I don't know if that's the framework, but if this is going to continually be what we see from the Cincinnati Bengals, again, I don't think the 2021 Super Bowl appearance, not win, appearance is going to carry them further. One last guy before we mention a couple honorable mentions and change, kind of talking about coaches and getting into players. Shane Steichen with the Indianapolis Colts. Gets reported today Anthony Richardson's going to miss training camp, re-injured the AC joint.
Mini camp.
Yeah, not training camp. Yes. Yeah, that's July. Mini camp. I love how there's just so many camps. It makes sense. It's you at least have OTAs and then training camp, but now we have these mini camps. All of them are meant to kind of initiate some phases of how offense and defenses are being installed. But in the case of mini camps, Anthony Richardson is going to miss out, which means Daniel Jones is going to get more reps. Riley Leonard is going to get more reps. So you wonder if they're going to be a little bit more confident, or as Shane Steichen would say, a little bit more consistent in the offense. So what does Shane Steichen have to do to keep his job in Indianapolis? And does a playoff berth really save him from this hot seat discussion a year from now? I think that's the twofold side of this is I feel like he's just going to be on this list unless for some reason they win 12 or 13 games and they look like the second coming of I don't even know who to compare them to, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think they need to make the playoffs in order for him to keep that spot. They've been on the cusp the last 2 years, right? 2 years ago, 9-8, right, with Gardner Minshew. Last year, I believe it was 8-9 with Richardson and Flacco and everything. Oh, it was Richardson, then Flacco, then Richardson again, following that whole fiasco. But I think what it comes down to is the Anthony Richardson experiment failing. I think that has to go on to Shane Steichen and Chris Ballard for that matter. I've been a Chris Ballard critic, but I like what they did this offseason. But if the quarterback they took fourth overall doesn't pan out, it's just not going to matter. If you can't get that guy to be an NFL starter, it's wraps for him. And I think that to some extent, it's not all on Steichen because he was able to work with Justin Herbert. He was able to work with Jalen Hurts in Philadelphia. And I certainly don't think Hurts is as physically talented or as physically gifted arm-wise as Anthony Richardson is. Leg-wise, he's the most physically gifted person in the entire league. But arm-wise, throwing-wise, I think Richardson has him beat there. But they haven't been able to find that consistency with Richardson. And I think that the timing aspect, not being able to teach him the rhythm and timing part, I think is ultimately what's going to sell Shane Steichen's fate in Indianapolis. And I think that we're going to see a full regime change next season. But I think if they make playoffs, to your point, he's just going to be on the hot seat again because who are they going to make the playoffs with this year? What if it's Daniel Jones, right? And it's like a Sam Darnold revival story, a Baker Mayfield revival story. Are they going to sign him to the Darnold deal or the Baker deal? Are they going to try to draft one of the young QBs because there's going to be 8 first-round QBs next year? What's the plan going to be for them? And I just think it's too murky at this point to say that he won't be on the hot seat next year going forward.
It's if for some reason they make the playoffs and you go, hey, we have the nucleus, we have this good roster, we have the right coaches because they brought Lou Anarumo in, they signed some veterans on defense, maybe the defense kind of starts pulling their weight. They have the offensive skill position guys, younger guys step up on their interior offensive line, the line's good. They could do what the Vikings just did and trade up to 10 and get JJ McCarthy. And we saw the Bills do that with Josh Allen. We saw the Chiefs do that with Patrick Mahomes in those, I wouldn't say heavier quarterback classes, but where you're seeing 3 to 5 guys go off the board in the first 15 picks. That's a scenario next year where I think they could be in favor where it's hey, we can use an extra third round, extra first in the future to move up and get that guy and take a second stab at this because we know the nucleus is working here. We just didn't have the right quarterback. That's going to have to be the direction. There's no other way around it. Otherwise, you're going to end up in this exact same scenario a year from now. Other guys that I think we need to touch on. We talked about the Browns being over leveraged, and I mentioned the Dolphins. The Dolphins went all in with the Tua, the Tyreek Hill, the Jalen Ramsey, some of the edge rushers that they had, and Jalen Phillips, just drafted Chop Robinson last year. But now it's come time to pay their dues. They don't have near the talent they had on their team. And I don't think they're going to make the playoffs. And so you go, okay, has this team really taken a step in the right direction with Mike McDaniel, Brian Callahan, Raheem Morris, guys going into their second year? If they don't figure it out, Raheem Morris, they were supposed to win the NFC South last year. They weren't able to beat Todd Bowles out. And now all of a sudden, you got to make it work with Michael Penix and this interesting roster where you have undersized edge rushers that could get run over and that could create issues for you on defense. Brian Callahan, you just had the first overall pick. If you aren't able to make it work and at least put together a couple wins and you're picking top 5 again next year, you're probably on the chopping block. And then we could throw in a Mike Tomlin here. I don't know if he really fits with either of these categories or one of these boxes we're trying to put these other coaches in. But at this point, Steelers fans are pretty upset that they just make the playoffs and they lose in the first round. And I would be too. You want to see runs, you want to see growth and not just the same thing over and over again. So anything out of those 4 guys that really, really caught your eye or that you really want to touch on more in depth?
I think Mike McDaniel, first of all, if you compare the 2 teams we talked about before that, the Bengals and the Colts, 2 teams that we think need to make the playoffs in order for these coaches to survive, and then compare that to the Dolphins, out of those 3 teams, let's say they're fighting for the 7th seed, which they were the past couple of years, who do you think makes it out of those teams? I certainly don't think it's the Dolphins. And for me, that's the point where I think Mike McDaniel is going to be on the chopping block, like you're saying. They went in on these veterans, didn't work, and now they have to pay the piper, like you're saying. So Mike McDaniel, if we had to rank all these guys, the top four, but McDaniel would be 5 for me. And then Mike Tomlin. Listen, being a Panthers fan, I would love for us to never have a losing season since I started watching football and consistently make the playoffs. Losing every year in the wild card, yeah, that would be a bummer. But these Steelers fans are so spoiled, they don't know what it's like to be in the trenches. But to that effect, at some point, expectations become so high since you've been doing that just making the playoffs isn't going to be enough. What I'll say about Tomlin is, and I'm glad you brought him up, like, 5 or 10 minutes before we started recording, they signed Aaron Rodgers to be their starting quarterback this year, a 1-year deal. That's funny, right? That's the team he beat in the Super Bowl, almost 15 years ago now. These are 2 historic franchises. Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner, actually mentioned on a talk show on Monday, wouldn't it be exciting if the Packers and Steelers are in the Super Bowl again? And now magically the Packers' greatest QB is now on the Steelers. And I think it's the most interesting part about this is the Steelers open week 1 in MetLife Stadium in New Jersey playing the New York Jets. And on Sunday Night Football week 8, they host the Packers. So the schedule makers knew what they were doing. Does Rodgers going to the Steelers change what your outcome or expectations are for them this season in your mind?
It's similar to Russ last year. He's able to stay healthy the entire year, and he plays the majority of the time. I think he offers a little bit more than Russ did. I think DK Metcalf offers a little bit more stability at the wide receiver 1 position, to where I think you could see a professional offense rolled out on Sundays, especially with the offensive line they're building. And we'll talk about one of those offensive line members here in a little bit. And I think it's very important that we're talking about Aaron Rodgers. And you want to keep a guy like him up at 41 years old. But he is a year removed from that Achilles injury, so he should be a little bit more spry than he was last year. So as long as he's not getting hurt, this is an opportunity for a Steelers team to at least go out and win a playoff game. Do they have the ability to make a run? I don't think so. But we've seen enough magic from Rodgers, enough from the Steelers team, where I think they could find a way to do that. And that puts yourself, I think, in the same place I just talked about the Colts, where you're probably picking in the early 20s. Send a couple of firsts in the future. Don't worry about what that's going to look like. Mike Tomlin can ilk out a lot of talent no matter who he has on the roster. Get the guy who's going to be the franchise cornerstone. And that's where some of these teams that we're talking about that have some of their head coaches on the hot seat, it's because you don't have that cornerstone. If you have that franchise quarterback, a lot of these questions start going away. And it just becomes a matter of, what do you need to get over the top? So conclude with the coaches, move into the players. We've already talked about Anthony Richardson. We already talked about him during the Shane Steichen. We talked about him with the crowded quarterback rooms. We talked about the injury. Is there anything that we want to really get off our chest that add to the discussion around him, other than that he has an uphill battle, and him missing mini camp and potentially this lingering injury heading the training camp could affect his reps in this offseason, which is pretty critical at this point in his career?
I don't think there's anything else to say that we haven't already said. He's on a seat that's an inferno right now. It's grown beyond the hot seat. It's grown beyond like a normal fire. Out of all the players we're going to talk about, I think he has the clearest path to leaving his position and having his position taken from him by a player that wins the battle in camp or in season. So nothing much to say there, other than I think he's also the most talented, like physically talented player out of all the guys that we'll mention. So he certainly has the chance. All the cards are in front of him. It's just up to how he plays them. But other than that, nothing much more to say. What I will say about the next guy is, I think this is a guy that really should and could be concerned this year about having his spot taken, and that's Jalen Polk, the former Washington Huskies receiver. Somebody both of us are high on in the draft. I think I had him in my top 40. He's currently on the 3rd team on Our Lads for the New England Patriots roster. Obviously, they bring in Stephon Diggs, Kyle Williams, Mac Hollins, who you hear Mac Hollins and don't think that's a big name. He led the Bills in touchdown receptions last year. So he's going to get on the field. And then they have guys like Pop Douglas, Kendrick Bourne, Kayshon Boutte, who came along well with Drake May. They have incumbent guys there. So I think he's really fighting an uphill battle. And now that that room is full of competition, he's going to have to step it up to the next level because I think he's talented. It's just like, how are they going to shoehorn him into the offense? Like some of these guys have defined roles. Some of these guys are young with potential, and some of them already have connections with Drake May. I think he's on the outside looking in.
The issue with Jalen Polk, and you can even add Javon Baker with that Patriots wide receiver room, where it's really their hands. They're talented players. I think there was enough on film last year that if they were to get moved around, especially with some of the additions and not forcing them to play outside, allowing them to play the slot a little bit more where they're more comfortable, you could see more production from some of these players. But again, if you can't bring in the ball, if you're going to keep dropping it, which seems to be an issue in some of the practices we're seeing and kind of leading up to this offseason. And so it's hard for me to get excited about Jalen Polk when he has the issues that two of the other wide receivers we're about to talk about that are kind of on the hot seat with having what seemed a starting role. Like that was the whole point of drafting him in the second round last year, is he was supposed to be one of the guys Drake May could count on. And he seemed like a dog in college for Michael Penix and was a guy that could be counted on. And that just has not translated to the next level. A guy that I called coming out of college because I saw it on the tape, but was Quentin Johnston. This guy needed to spend time in front of a jugs machine, and not just a jugs machine, like work on the hand-eye coordination and catching away from his body. And it just hasn't materialized. And it's not been that he hasn't been able to produce in year two. He had some moments where he put up yards, he caught some touchdown passes.
Versus Carolina in particular, he had those moments.
Yeah. So, and you can point those out. But again, like when you look at the moments where it's like you need him to go get you a bucket, I don't think you can necessarily count on that. And it's okay. So you bring in Ladd McConkey. You just drafted Trey Harris to really be the Josh Palmer replacement. If those two guys kind of become the go-to, this is going to be a more run-heavy offense with Najee Harris and Omarion Hampton behind that offensive line. It just starts to become a little bit more worrisome with Quentin Johnston. It's like you just become a Cordell Patterson or this gadget gimmick player that you might go off in a certain week. And if you were lucky enough to start him in fantasy that week, like good for you kind of situation. But like that's what Quentin Johnston is starting to get amounted to. And he was a first-round pick. This was a guy that was picked in the first round ahead of a couple other wide receivers. He wasn't picked ahead of Jackson Smith and Jigba, but he was picked ahead of Zay Flowers and Jordan Addison, two guys that have definitely proved they are better wide receivers and would probably be a better fit in that Los Angeles Chargers offense with Justin Herbert.
The Chargers also bring back Mike Williams this offseason, coming back from Pittsburgh. So if Mike Williams plays his regular role, like as your outside downfield receiver, Quentin Johnston's not starting. And at that point, I think that's where the seat starts to heat up. It gets murkier because you got to remember this was a former first-round pick, top 25 first-round pick. So can certainly see it there. We added Xavier Legette as well, another first-round pick. Although he was 32nd, we traded up for him. I think he has – I don't think his seat's necessarily hot. I think the expectations have improved, though, because you draft Tedero McMillan at 8 overall, kind of to take the pressure off of Legette, give him more favorable matchups. Don't force him to play the X like he had to down the stretch last year. I think that's where you saw a lot of the mental mistakes and catching mistakes is when he had to play that position. I think where the hot seat comes in for him is if he doesn't have a step up in production, not having to be the guy. Like, let's say, I think a reasonable expectation for him this year is anywhere from like 550 to 750 yards in that range. If he's not meeting those thresholds, I think that's where the concern starts for him, because you had a talented rookie undrafted free agent last year, Jalen Coker, outperform him down the stretch. You have a top 10 pick now at receiver, and you have some ancillary pieces like Jimmy Horn Jr., who can be the speed gadget guy on the field. Xavier Legette could have been the gadget guy as well, but if he doesn't step up to those standards, he might be a year ahead of where Quentin Johnston is and then eventually start to fall in the pecking order.
The issue is, and it goes back to the exact same points about Quentin Johnston and Jalen Polk. There have been opportunities to make plays. And for Xavier Legette, when Deontay Johnson gets booted from the team and trade him to Baltimore, get the toxicity out of the locker room, he started just having these mental lapses when it came to his hands. He could not catch outside of the numbers. And all of the production you saw early on in the year of him working out of the slot, kind of getting some yak, being a productive player in the red zone, like all of that seemed to just dissipate. And so you're hoping, like you said, with Tedero McMillan, some of these other ancillary weapons, that he can get back to that. But if he doesn't, like you said, there are a lot of young wide receivers that are nipping at his heel. And it's one of those situations where we're talking about a guy taken with a top 50 pick, not panning out. And so that's the issue with Xavier Legette. Main reason I have him on here is because it's just insane aura farming he's been doing this offseason. Like, we're getting to the point now where it's just like his legacy in terms of just his media presence, and he's a cool guy, don't get me wrong, like he deserves all the tape on him, but if your production isn't matching that, it's like what are we doing here? I'm like, that's where I just want to see, like you said, over 500 yards. Let's see that same touchdown count or a few more receptions there. Like, let's see that step in growth, because there's no reason for you not to. And if not, like you said, Jimmy Horn, Jalen Coker, they're right there. Moving on to the next guy. We're moving away from wide receivers and heading to a running back that I think a lot of people thought from a production standpoint was going to take a jump last year. And that was Breece Hall. He had been a year removed from his ACL. We had seen running backs kind of take a jump back into action. So a lot of people are gung-ho about like Breece Hall is going to be that guy. And he wasn't really a difference maker, I think, on that Jets offense. I think Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson, which much more impactful players. We didn't hear a lot from Breece Hall. They draft Braylon Allen last year. They draft Isaiah Davis this year. Do you think he's an RB1? Like, and I'm not like saying this like from a fantasy standpoint. I'm saying this like, is this a guy that you feel comfortable having out on all three downs, or is the reason why you have the competition in the room it's because you don't feel confident in him being that guy?
I think running back is probably the seat that's always the hottest, at least on offense, because the churn rate on running backs is pretty high. As far as Breece Hall goes, yeah, I think if he doesn't meet the expectations, you can't really call him a top 18 running back. Top 15 in my mind of a position is like that position one, right? Like top 15 running backs are RB1s. Same thing with receivers, quarterbacks, whatever. Yeah, I think there's a good chance he falls outside of that threshold for me. And then at that point, like you're saying, the Jets over the past half decade, or at least when Joe Douglas drafted, they used, it's not my strategy, but I like the strategy of having a running back in every single draft. And the Jets have been doing that. And at a certain point, the old one gets pushed out because he's just the oldest, or he has injuries, or the young guys are fresher and have better legs. So I could certainly see maybe Braylon Allen taking the RB1 mantle in the second half of the year from Breece Hall for the Jets. And to that effect, I think with Fields being in the fray, they're going to try to do a lot more heavy looks, like 13 personnel, more run-heavy stuff. And I think that lends itself more to Braylon Allen, who's the bigger body, who can take more stuff. He can be a fullback if Isaiah Davis needs to run or something like that. So I think you could see Breece Hall getting phased out if he doesn't have some high-end immediate production to start the year.
And we'll be keeping an eye monitoring that, but it's just something to look at, because like you said, they have Justin Fields now at quarterback. It makes sense with a guy that has more of a Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels frame in terms of not being super, super thick like a Josh Allen or big, that you're going to have a bruiser running back for some of those read option looks to create a lot of leverage, whether it be RPO or the read. Moving forward, let's switch at the defense, then go back to offense, and then end on defense. Mazi Smith. He was on, is it Feldman's freak list? I think it's Feldman's freak list. Yes,
Bruce Feldman.
Yep. His freak list a couple years ago, I think Mazi Smith was at the top or close to. Insane dude coming out of Michigan. Like, freak athlete. You saw it on tape. I went back this past offseason, and his havoc numbers were like disgustingly close to like guys like Shamar Stewart, Mikael Williams. And granted, he played inside, but it was just more that sense of just like, this isn't really a productive interior defensive lineman. He was drafted because of traits. And what's shocking is the Cowboys typically are really good at identifying players in the draft. But I would say this has been a miss for them. And considering, I would say their run fitting, even some of their interior pass rushing ability outside of a Zigadua has been subpar. And so I think Mozzie Smith taking a step here in year 3 is going to be very critical. And if not, it lends itself to now the Cowboys have to spend resources, whether it be money in free agency or draft capital next year, and replenishing that position. And I feel like that is going to be a kind of the Achilles heel for the Cowboys, is stopping the run. And it has been over the past couple of years. And Mozzie Smith is a part of that equation.
It certainly doesn't help when you're starting defensive ends because they move to an even front with Zimmer. It doesn't help that your guys like Micah Parsons, Dante Fowler, even Donovan Ezeraku, guys that you drafted, are on the smaller side. So you're depending on Mozzie Smith to be that run fitter, to be the guy that can stop the run. He just hasn't done that. At Michigan, it was easy to see that he was that guy, but he also had guys like Aiden Hutchinson beside him, David Ajabo, Mason Graham overlapped for 1 year there, I think. I don't think he and Kenneth Grant were ever on the same team, but when you see Kenneth Grant and how he plays, even though he's much more raw, I think, much less polished prospect, he's so much more translatable to the NFL level. That's why he was a top 15 pick to the Miami Dolphins. So I think you're right. The Cowboys need a solution there. If Mozzie Smith isn't that solution next year, I think they could easily be looking to take defensive tackle or interior defensive line in free agency or early in the draft. Last thing on him, I thought it was a big priority for them this offseason, and they didn't really do anything outside of late round and UDFA. So I think the pressure is really, really on Mozzie Smith to prove that he belongs, to prove that he is a worthy first-round pick, because the Cowboys willingly extend their own guys, even if it's late, like they usually wait a while to do it. And if he can prove that he's that guy, he'll get himself the deal from the Cowboys. But otherwise, yeah, I can see him getting replaced pretty quickly.
And that's kind of it. This is it. This is the year 3 breakout, or you're kind of done. And so I think Mozzie Smith has one last shot at the starting gig before he kind of ends up on that trajectory where you're in one city for 1 year, and then you pick up and move on for a couple years.
I think Javon Kinlaw is they're different players, but I think that route is a perfect comparison to Mozzie Smith.
It's an excellent one. Going on the offensive side of the ball, where we talked about Aaron Rodgers and his production, I love what they've done on the interior at the left tackle spot. My question is Broderick Jones, the big tackle you drafted out of Georgia a couple years ago in the first round. He was initially kind of the guy that Dan Moore, who's now the Tennessee Titans left tackle, that's kind of the position he was in. And so now we're seeing him as like the full-fledged right tackle. And so I'm just curious, didn't work out at left tackle. You're now trying it at right tackle. If you cannot protect Aaron Rodgers, I think that just becomes an indictment on you as a player. And so it's a weak link system when we talk about the offensive line. And I feel really confident about the other 4 pieces on that group outside of Broderick Jones. So again, a year 3 player, similar to Mozzie Smith, where I feel like you really have to take a step as a player, similar to, and I hate putting like Ike Ekwonu in this box, but like it felt like Ike Ekwonu and Evan Neal. Year 3, Ike Ekwonu, it felt like he took that step where he's still getting better. Evan Neal got to the point where they're kicking him in the guard and he's a backup guard now. And so that's where I think when we're talking about Broderick Jones, it's like, okay, this is where you have to show you're a starter. You have to take that step as a player, and them not re-signing Dan Moore, I think, is an indictment of going, hey, we have this trust and faith in you. Don't lose it. Because Omar Khan's not afraid to take an offensive lineman in the first round.
For sure. I think he's going from the right to the left this year because Moore was the left tackle. And I'm pretty sure Broderick Jones played right last year. So I think that's he's going to be left. He's going to be left this year, Broderick Jones is, which is his natural position. I just wanted to be sure on that one. And that's what he played in college. But again, in college, the Georgia O linemen, I don't know if it's just a platoon thing, but they always don't stay on the field very long. So how he'll be a full-time 17 game left tackle, that's going to be the question this year. And you're right. Looking at their churn or their changes, Rodgers is now the new QB. Caleb Johnson, we expect to be the starting running back. DK Metcalf, new wide receiver 1. That whole O-line is going to be the same, right? From Jones to Troy Faltanu on the other side. And then the last point I'll bring up is that Fautano from the University of Washington a couple years ago, he's a multiple player. He played like 4 positions in college. If Broderick Jones, like you're saying, or not like you're saying, if he doesn't live up to the expectation, he could be going back to right side and have Fautano play the left if they feel more comfortable there. So he has big shoes to fill, I think this year. And I think they need him to take that step, like you're saying, the year 3 breakout, similar to Ike Ekwonu, and prove that he deserves to be a full-time left tackle. Because like you're saying, Omar Khan isn't afraid to do it, right? We've seen him do it the past couple of years. Even with the interior, he hasn't taken interior guys in the first round, but he has in the second and third round. So he wants that front to be solid. And if there's like a slight hesitation in one of them, he is going to replace them with the quickness.
Yeah. Zach Frazier, Mason McCormick, these are interior offensive linemen he's drafted a couple years ago. You talked about Fontenot that he took at the top. He is intentionally trying to build the trenches out. You have Caleb Johnson out of Iowa, who's an excellent running back. So that those kind of pieces, you're just hoping kind of lend itself to the Steelers mentality that they uphold the standard. And I think it really comes down to Broderick Jones. I know this is an X Factor episode, but like I really think he is going to be what holds it all together, that linchpin. Last guy I want to talk about, and maybe it's unfair to say this because he is a good starter in the NFL. But when you take a linebacker in the first round, I think there's this expectation that you're going to be top 10 at your position. Like you are going to be one of those dudes that's talked about. And I just haven't gotten that from Jack Campbell in Detroit. Like the whole point about him being big, physical, rangy is he was supposed to be a menace in the run game and the pass game. And I just haven't seen that. Like the whole, you're not supposed to hear about a player who's supposed to go along the lines of like offensive linemen. Like we don't hear about Broderick Jones. That's a good thing. Not hearing about Jack Campbell and him flying around the field, that's what concerns me, especially when you've had some of the injuries up front, when you have some of the transition you do on the back end and the secondary. This is a player that I think needs to step up again heading into year 3.
For sure. I think he needs to step up. I think his seat is probably lukewarm compared to some of these other like scalding or hot seats, so to speak. I think he's performed well in coverage. For me, it's in the run game. And especially because that front has been so besieged by injuries, so porous throughout the year. I think he needs to step up and be the run fitter that a first-round pick should be, right? Somebody that you expect to become a top 10 pick at your position. I think that draft class in particular for Detroit kind of skews expectations for those top 4 players in particular because they're all non-premium guys, right? Jahmyr Gibbs, at worst, second or third best running back in the league right now, right? Brian Branch, probably a top 10 safety, top 5 nickel corner. He's grown into that. Sam Laporta, another top 10 tight end, right? But Campbell, I think, is the odd man out. I was looking at PFF grades earlier. He was 23rd overall out of like 180 linebackers. So he's certainly in the upper tier, but because those other 3 non-premium positions became elite and he's kind of lagging behind that, I think that's where the disconnect really is. And because it was 4 non-premiums up front and people were going to question it, but then 3 of them worked out, I think a lot of us, and I'm not saying that you're guilty of this, but I think the entire NFL sphere kind of gets hung up on that 4th guy. It's like, why isn't he elite like the other guys were when they had the first round pick used on him, especially when they have other needs now, right? We're going to see all 3 of their starting interior offensive linemen be new starters this year. We're going to see guys on the defensive line continue to not struggle, but have a little bit of rotation there because they still haven't found that piece opposite of Aiden Hutchinson. Had they gone in that direction, and then this guy turns into, let's say, the 20th best edge rusher, I don't think there's as big a question as it is if he's not a top 10 linebacker, like you're saying.
That's the disconnect, is simply the position being played. And you worded it perfectly there at the end, is it's different from being a top 20 edge rusher and a top 10 or a top 20 linebacker. And that discrepancy is, I think, really what kind of it puts me on edge about Jack Campbell. Again, a hot seat may not be the right word. It may just be like mildly disappointed in kind of where he's at. And what I mean by this trajectory is you're now going to have guys like Jahmyr Gibbs Brian Branch, Sam Laporta that are going to come up for extensions the same exact time because they're drafted in the same class. And you're going to pay those guys because they're your stars. Those are cornerstones on your team. And when it comes time to pay him, it feels like he's going to be a Tremaine Edmonds for the Buffalo Bills, where this was a first-round pick. He was a solid player, gave you production on that rookie contract, but he doesn't get to that second one. He wasn't that difference maker that he was supposed to be drafted with that first-round pedigree. And that's where I think where the hot seat comes in is that if you don't do enough to change the mantra in Detroit, you're going to be moving on to another city sooner rather than later, or you're going to take less money to stay with the team that drafted you. It's going to be one of those two things. But I don't see superstar on this guy. And this feels like the year to break out or just continue being the average player that he kind of is at the moment.
For sure. Could be like his seat's lukewarm now. If he doesn't break out, we're getting a really hot seat next year. Kind of like how we talked about with some of the coaches, right? If they might have like a lukewarm seat now, but if they miss playoffs or don't overperform, next year's the year that, all right, we might get you out of here, because every year, 6 to 8 coaches, there's turnover there. I don't think there's ever been a year where there's not been a single coach fired. And the least that I can remember was like 4 a couple years ago. So there are going to be changes. And I think that's going to be a good transition into Purrfect Takes territory, because a couple weeks ago when we did crowded quarterbacks, I think we talked a little bit about coach firings or who might be the first guy let go. I'm going to go to our honorable mentions list. So that was Mike McDaniel, Brian Callahan, Raheem Morris, and maybe Mike Tomlin. We'll see with the Aaron Rodgers thing. And I'm going to say from that list, Mike McDaniel will be I don't know if he'll be the lone coach fired from that group, but he will not be retained as the head coach of the Miami Dolphins for 2026. I think I don't want to say scheming, but like the plot that the Dolphins and Chris Greer laid out didn't work. It's caught up to them, and I just don't see a way in which they make the playoffs unless he and Tua have that run that they had in 2023 where everything clicks. They're just a nuclear offense and get everything working. I don't think that's going to happen. And so I think Mike McDaniel is going to be out the door at the end of the year.
Do you think Tua goes with them because they have an out after this year? Do you think they just wipe the slate clean if that's the case?
I would say no. And because I don't think they have enough infrastructure anywhere else to keep the team. You never want to go from 8-9 to like 2 wins. And I think that even if they keep Jalen Ramsey, I think that their secondary isn't the greatest. I like their edge rusher room. I think we know the problems with their O-line, and if they don't hire another Shanahan guy, then O-line is going to have to be a priority. I think there are a ton of premium positions across the team where they just don't have enough, and I think keeping Tua in there for like a 1 or 2 year holdover could help the next group come in and say, all right, he's been able to do it with this lackluster group, or not do it, but like play NFL football with the lackluster group. Let's keep this in place while we build out the bones of the rest of the team. And then it's like the Steelers, the Colts situation where, all right, we might be picking 18. Let's go up and get our guy, and Tua can be the 1 or 2 year bridge. So that's kind of my thinking, that Tua's a top 18 quarterback, and that's good enough to keep in a transition period at least.
I'm torn between like 2 different takes here. I don't know if I want to lean towards the fact that Shane Steichen finds a way, they make the playoffs despite the quarterback, or if I just lean into the easy one and say at the end of this year, Brian Dable and Kevin Stefanski are fired. And I think that's just the easier one. So I think I'll head there. Once we do maybe some of the division reviews, we have a better idea and concept of how the NFL landscape looks based on just scheduling and how things could fall from September to December. We'll hold the Shane Steichen. But this week's Purrfect Take, Brian Dable, Kevin Stefanski, 2 guys with crowded quarterback rooms that we have a lot of questions about their current roster and have dug holes based on the decisions they've been a part of. I think that's the take, that those 2 are no longer hired by their current teams.
I'll give you a chance to further it or to make it a little more spicy since it's the easy one. Are they fired in season or after the season? Or you can say you don't want to answer and that they're just fired.
I think Stefanski makes it to the end of the year. We've seen the Haslam family, and they're willing to be more patient. Like, I feel like if I'm gonna get bit in the butt by any take, it's gonna be that. The Giants, it's like interesting. Like the Mora family is like they're finicky. Like when they're done, but they typically let things ride out. But I feel like we've seen the Giants slate. Like it is vicious. Like it would not be hard to go like 1-6, 1-7 out of the gate. So I think if we're talking about any of the coaches we've talked about, like Dable probably is the best candidate for being in season. So I'd have to lean Dable in season, Stefanski at the end of the year if I had to lean one way or the other.
I could definitely see that they promote Kafka to be like the interim guy because he used to call plays, if I'm not mistaken. I think he called plays the year that they went to the playoffs, or maybe it was the year after that. They promote him, and he's the guy to cultivate whatever's in Jackson Dart, and that's like the end of season schedule for them. But I like your take. I like my take. Next week we'll probably do another Mount Rushmore. I'm thinking wide receivers. Like I got a lot of wide receiver 3 and 4 debates I'd like to have. So I think that might be the direction we go in. But until then, you can find us on Twitter, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your content. And we will be back. But until then, keep pounding.